Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about wealth inequality. They assume it's about work ethic, education, talent, or even luck. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? We're taught from childhood that hard work pays off, that getting the right degree opens doors, that innovation gets rewarded. But here's where it gets interesting, and honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how modern economies actually distribute wealth. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. And the design has nothing to do with merit. Think about this for a second. You know people who work 60, 70 hours a week, people with advanced degrees, people who built businesses from nothing, who innovate, who create genuine value, and yet the vast majority of wealth accumulation in the past 4 decades hasn't gone to any of them. It's gone to a different category of participant entirely. People who own things. Not people who make things, not people who do things, but people whose primary economic activity is holding assets that appreciate. That's not a moral judgment. That's just observable reality. And the mechanism that makes this happen, the actual architecture that directs wealth upward regardless of productive contribution, that mechanism is invisible to most people. Not because it's secret, but because it's so fundamental to how the system operates that it becomes like water to a fish, completely surrounding you, completely shaping your reality, and completely unnoticed. The numbers tell a story that's hard to argue with. Between 1980 and 2020, productivity in advanced economies increased by roughly 70%. That means the average worker produces 70% more value per hour than their counterpart 4 decades ago. Technology, education, efficiency gains, all of it compounding. So you'd expect compensation to track with productivity, right? That's how the bargain is supposed to work. You produce more, you earn more. Except that's not what happened. Real wages for the median worker increased by about 12% over that same period. Meanwhile, the wealth of the top 1% increased by over 300%. That's not a small divergence. That's a structural separation. And it didn't happen because the top 1% suddenly started working harder or became more talented. It happened because the rules governing how wealth accumulates changed in ways that favored asset ownership over labor contribution. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what capital actually represents in a modern financial system. And I mean really think about it, because this is where the whole thing clicks into place. Capital isn't just money sitting in a bank account. It's a claim on future value extraction. When you own capital, whether that's stocks, real estate, intellectual property, or financial instruments, you're not primarily getting paid for what you do. You're getting paid for what you own. And here's the critical distinction that most economic education completely glosses over. The returns on capital compound in ways that returns on labor fundamentally cannot. Let me walk you through exactly why this structural difference matters. When you earn income through labor, you trade time and effort for compensation. There's a hard ceiling on that transaction because you only have so many hours, so much energy, so much lifespan. Even if you're extraordinarily talented, even if you work every waking hour, your earning potential tops out somewhere. Maybe it's a high ceiling if you're a surgeon or a software engineer or a corporate executive, but it's still a ceiling. The relationship between input and output remains relatively linear. You work more, you earn more, but the scaling is limited by fundamental biological and temporal constraints. Capital operates under completely different mathematics. When you own an asset, your return isn't constrained by your time or effort. The asset can appreciate while you sleep. It can generate dividends, interest, rental income, or capital gains without you lifting a finger. And critically, the returns themselves can be reinvested to purchase more assets, which generate more returns, which purchase more assets. This is compounding in its purest form. The growth becomes exponential rather than linear. A person with $10 million in appreciating assets, assuming a conservative 7% annual return, makes $700,000 that year without working at all. That $700,000 can be reinvested, generating another $49,000 the following year just from that increment. The math doesn't care about merit, it just runs. Now layer on top of that the question of access. Who gets to participate in this compounding mechanism? That's where the algorithm I'm talking about really starts to operate. Because in theory, anyone could invest, buy stocks, purchase property, build a portfolio. That's the narrative anyway, the democratization of capital. But the actual mechanics reveal something different. To meaningfully participate in capital appreciation, you need surplus, money beyond what's required for immediate consumption. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, which roughly 60% of American households report doing, even with household incomes above $250,000, you have zero surplus, zero capacity to purchase appreciating assets. Your entire income goes to rent, food, transportation, healthcare, debt service. There's nothing left to convert into capital. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting from a systems perspective. The same economic structure that makes it difficult to accumulate surplus when you're starting from labor income actively accelerates accumulation once you cross a certain threshold of existing capital. It's not a linear progression where a little capital helps a little bit and more capital helps proportionally more. It's a threshold effect. Below a certain level of capital ownership, you're effectively locked out of the compounding mechanism. Above that threshold, the system's entire architecture works in your favor. Think about how asset purchases actually function at different wealth levels. If you have $20,000 saved and you want to invest in real estate, that $20,000 might cover a down payment on a modest property in a secondary market. You'll need to qualify for a mortgage, which means proving stable income, passing credit checks, shouldering the risk of debt service. The property might appreciate or it might not. You're carrying significant leverage risk. Now contrast that with someone who has $2 million in liquid capital. They can purchase properties outright, no mortgage needed, no debt service eating into cash flow. They can wait for optimal market conditions, cherry-pick undervalued assets, negotiate from a position of strength. When the property appreciates, the entire gain is theirs. When the market drops, they have reserves to weather the storm or even purchase more assets at distressed prices. The wealthier participant isn't just playing the same game with more chips. They're playing a fundamentally different game with different rules and different mathematics. This same pattern replicates across every asset class. In equity markets, wealthy investors get access to private placements, pre-IPO shares, hedge fund strategies that require minimum investments of $1 million or more. The average retail investor gets access to whatever's available on public exchanges, usually after early investors have already captured the most explosive growth phases. In debt markets, wealthy individuals and institutions can lend money at rates that reflect actual risk, capturing the spread between their cost of capital and the borrower's payment. The person without capital pays those rates instead of collecting them. Every transaction sorts participants into capital providers and capital consumers, and the sorting mechanism is entirely circular. You become a capital provider by already having capital. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out in practice. Take the 2008 financial crisis. Housing markets collapsed, equity markets cratered, unemployment spiked. For the median household, this meant wealth destruction. Home values dropped, retirement accounts evaporated, job security vanished. By 2010, median household wealth had declined by nearly 40% from its 2007 peak. But for households in the top 10% of wealth distribution, the crisis created a generational buying opportunity. Assets were suddenly available at deep discounts. Distressed properties, undervalued stocks, bankrupt businesses selling for parts. If you had capital and liquidity in 2009 and 2010, you could acquire assets that would appreciate by 200, 300, 400% over the following decade. If you didn't have capital, you were trying to survive, not invest. The crisis took wealth from those who had little and transferred it to those who had enough to deploy when prices bottomed. That's not a conspiracy. It's just how asset markets function when they encounter volatility. Volatility punishes those who need to sell and rewards those who can buy. Now add to this something that makes the wealth concentration particularly significant. The policy response to financial crises over the past 15 years has systematically reinforced this dynamic. When markets crash, central banks intervene by lowering interest rates and purchasing assets. The stated goal is economic stabilization, prevent a deflationary spiral, keep credit flowing, support employment. Those are legitimate objectives. But the mechanism through which this stabilization occurs is asset price inflation. By buying bonds and mortgage-backed securities, central banks drive up the prices of financial assets. Who owns financial assets? Disproportionately the already wealthy. The top 10% of households own roughly 85% of stocks, 90% of bonds, 70% of real estate equity. So when policy interventions inflate asset prices to prevent economic collapse, the primary beneficiaries are those who already own substantial assets. The person who owns nothing gets stable employment maybe. The person who owns 10 million in assets sees their net worth increase by 2 million. This creates a feedback loop that's genuinely difficult to escape once you understand the architecture. Economic growth drives asset appreciation. Asset appreciation concentrates wealth among existing asset holders. Concentrated wealth gets reinvested in more assets, accelerating the compounding effect. When crisis threatens, policy interventions protect asset values, preventing the kind of wealth redistribution that might occur if assets were allowed to lose value permanently. The system contains a ratchet mechanism. Wealth concentrates during expansions and gets protected during contractions. The only direction is up, but only if you're already in the game. Here's another layer that deserves serious attention. The tax structure in most developed economies reinforces rather than counteracts this pattern. Labor income gets taxed at the highest rates. If you earn your money through a salary or wages, you're paying income tax, payroll tax, often at progressive rates that can reach 40 or 50% when you include state and local taxes. But capital gains, the profits from selling appreciated assets, get taxed at lower rates. In the United States, long-term capital gains are capped at 20% federally, often less when you account for various deductions and strategies. So the person earning $200,000 through labor might pay $70,000 in taxes. The person earning $200,000 through capital appreciation might pay $40,000. Same income, different tax treatment, and the differential specifically favors the wealth accumulation mechanism that already compounds faster. And it doesn't stop there. Wealth can be transferred across generations with minimal taxation if structured correctly. Estate planning, trust structures, dynasty trusts, generation-skipping transfers. The tools exist to move capital from one generation to the next while avoiding or minimizing estate taxes. This means the compounding doesn't reset with each generation. It accumulates dynastically. The grandchild of someone who built substantial capital in the 1950s starts their adult life with wealth that's been compounding for 70 years. They didn't earn it through their own productivity. They inherited a position in the capital ownership structure. Meanwhile, the grandchild of someone who worked for wages in the 1950s starts from zero, or more likely, from negative, given student debt and other liabilities required to even compete in the labor market. Think about what happens when you combine these elements. Capital compounds faster than labor, policy protects capital during downturns, taxes favor capital over labor, and capital transfers dynastically. You get exactly what we observe: wealth concentration that accelerates over time regardless of productive contribution, talent, or effort. The algorithm isn't about who deserves what. It's about who owns what and how the rules governing ownership are written. Now let's project this forward and examine what it means for broader systemic stability. At the immediate level, concentrated wealth translates directly into concentrated political influence. When a small percentage of the population controls the majority of capital, they also control the majority of lobbying capacity, campaign contributions, media ownership, think tank funding. This isn't shadowy conspiracy, it's just rational resource deployment. If you have substantial capital, you have substantial interest in shaping the rules that govern capital, and you have the resources to fund that shaping. The result is policy drift that consistently favors capital preservation and appreciation, even when those policies generate broader social costs. At the regional and national level, extreme wealth concentration creates demand-side problems that no amount of monetary policy can fully address. When the majority of income gains flow to the top few percent, consumption patterns change. Wealthy households save and invest much higher percentages of their income than middle-income households. That's not a criticism, it's just mathematics. If you earn $10 million annually, you're not spending $10 million on consumption. You're spending maybe $1 million and investing $9 million. Contrast that with a household earning $60,000. They're probably spending $55,000 and saving $5,000. When income shifts from the $60,000 household to the $10 million household, aggregate consumption falls relative to aggregate production. This creates persistent demand shortfalls that require ever-increasing debt levels to bridge. Households borrow to maintain consumption, governments borrow to fund services, and the debt itself becomes another mechanism for wealth extraction as interest flows from borrowers to capital holders. At the global economic level, we're seeing capital accumulation outpace productive investment. There's so much wealth concentrated at the top of the distribution that it exceeds the number of genuinely productive investment opportunities. This drives capital into speculative assets, real estate bubbles, financial engineering, asset price inflation, disconnected from underlying economic fundamentals. When capital earns higher returns from speculation than from productive enterprise, resources flow away from activities that generate actual goods and services and toward activities that shuffle existing wealth between participants. The economy becomes increasingly financialized, and financial crises become more frequent and more severe because the speculative structures eventually exceed their sustainable limits. And here's what makes this particularly unsettling to anyone thinking about long-term social stability. The legitimacy of any economic system depends on some perceived connection between contribution and reward. People will tolerate substantial inequality if they believe it reflects differential talent, effort, risk-taking, or value creation. But when inequality becomes visibly disconnected from contribution, when people can observe that wealth accumulates primarily through ownership rather than productivity, the system's moral legitimacy erodes. That erosion doesn't happen overnight. It builds gradually as each generation confronts the reality that the opportunities their parents accessed are no longer available at the same price. Education costs more, but delivers less economic security. Housing consumes a larger share of income, but represents a smaller share of household wealth. Retirement requires more savings, but generates lower returns. The implicit social contract, the idea that playing by the rules leads to security and modest prosperity, breaks down when the rules themselves are structured to deliver most of the gains to those who already have capital. These trends aren't happening in separate boxes. They interact and reinforce each other. Economic concentration generates political capture. Political capture shapes policy to favor capital. Capital favoring policy accelerates concentration. Accelerated concentration creates demand problems. Demand problems require debt. Debt creates more wealth extraction opportunities for capital holders. The cycle reinforces itself, and each iteration makes the next one more pronounced. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not a system where hard work and talent reliably generate wealth. What you see is a system where existing capital generates more capital through structural mechanisms that operate independently of individual merit. The algorithm is simple. Own appreciating assets, benefit from compounding returns, navigate policy environments that protect asset values, transfer wealth dynastically. The reason you're not rich in most cases isn't that you're not working hard enough or that you're not talented enough. It's that you're starting from the wrong side of the capital ownership threshold, and the mathematical structure of returns makes it extraordinarily difficult to cross that threshold through labor income alone. The real question is not whether this system is fair. Fairness is subjective. The real question is whether this level of concentration is sustainable. Can an economic system function indefinitely when the vast majority of gains flow to a small minority of participants? Can political institutions maintain legitimacy when policy consistently reflects the interests of capital holders rather than the majority of citizens? Can demand support production when income concentration suppresses mass consumption? History suggests that extreme concentration eventually produces either reform or rupture, gradual policy adjustment that rebalances the distribution, or sudden crisis that forces reset. We're not at the rupture point yet, but the structural contradictions are assembling faster than the corrective mechanisms. And here's the thing that keeps this pattern so durable. The people who benefit most from the current structure are also the people with the most capacity to prevent its reform. They fund the think tanks that produce the intellectual justification for capital-friendly policy. They own the media that shapes public discourse about economic policy. They finance the political campaigns that determine who writes the rules. This isn't a conspiracy. It's just rational self-interest operating at scale. If you benefit from the status quo, you work to preserve it. And if you have capital, you have the tools to make that work effective. The next time you hear someone explain wealth inequality as a natural outcome of talent distribution or work ethic differences, try holding all of these pieces together in the same frame. The compound mathematics, the threshold effects, the policy protections, the tax differentials, the dynastic transfers, the political capture, the feedback loops. Because they're not separate stories, they're different angles on the same architecture. An architecture that determines who accumulates wealth not primarily through merit, but through position. And that position, once established, becomes nearly impossible to dislodge. Not because the system is broken, but because it's working exactly as designed. The question we're not asking loudly enough is, designed for whom and at what cost to everyone else?